Welcome to the 12th Resiliency Dialogues of Project ProTech. Tonight, we are very honored and privileged to have two um, activists to share their life stories and insights with us on anti-Black, anti-Indigenous racism and ways that we can build coalition and solidarity strategies. But before we welcome them, I would like to invite you to do our poll so that we can get to know you a little bit better as our participants for the forum. All time. So as we continue to meet people, I'd like to introduce our team, Rain, who is our community engagement coordinator, and Keith, our manager for Project Protect, and I'm Alan Lee. I'm one of the researcher on the team for Project Protect. And Rain, can I invite you to do our land acknowledgement?
Yes. So we here at ProTech, we're very grateful and honored to be on this land here. Well, I'll just say it anyway. So we're on Treaty 13th. We are honored to acknowledge that we're on the sacred land covered by Treaty 13th with the Mississaugas with the credits and the Williams Treaties signed with the multiple Mississaugas and Chippewa bands. Toronto is located on the Dish with One Spoon territory, which is a treaty between the Anishinaabe, Mississauga, and Haudenosaunee that bounds each other to share the territory and protect the land. Subsequent Indigenous nations and newcomers were invited into this treaty in the spirit of peace, friendship, and respect to share and care for the resources of this land. And we are aware of the ongoing impact of colonialism, racism, and other forms of discrimination and social injustices that disproportionately impacts Indigenous people here, as well as racialized communities here on Turtle Island. We stand in solidarity to continue our fight against anti-Indigenous, anti-Black, anti-Asian, Islamophobia, and any other forms of racism and social oppressions locally and globally. So, before we begin, we also just want to remind everyone that this session, we're not going to be tolerating any harassments of any kind, so make sure that we're all able to respect each other and listen to one another. If you're muted, you're welcome to share into the chat. If you click on the drop-down menu, you can click panelists and attendees to share your comments. If you want to speak, you can also use the raise hand function, and then one of us will unmute you. If you are speaking, please make sure that there are minimal background noises and movements of your cameras. And obviously, it goes quite obvious, but make sure you dress appropriately and the camera is on your face and nowhere else. Please do not take screenshots of conversations. This will be recorded and it will be shown later on YouTube channel, so you can check us out again there as well. And again, please be courteous and respectful to all the other participants. Yes.
So thank you again. And we are very excited to have two activists, Mei Lu and Melissa Chang Moet, with us tonight. And they have been at the forefront of many anti-oppression, anti-racism work for many years. And I'm especially excited to welcome Melissa to join us from Winnipeg. Welcome. So I'll invite them to introduce themselves more, because I think the exciting thing is also they would be sharing some of their life stories in terms of how different forms of racism impact their lives and how we all connected in different ways. So without further ado, maybe I will invite Melissa to first begin.
Thanks, Alan. Thank you, ProTech, and everyone on the team for inviting me to speak today. I'd like to first acknowledge that I'm calling in from Winnipeg, and so I'm on Treaty 1 territory. It's the traditional land of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Oji-Cree, and it's the homeland of the Métis Nation. So today I'm going to start by sharing a bit about my personal story and my family story, because it has greatly impacted, how I've experienced racism in my life, but it's also impacted, the areas in which I've chosen to work and study. And just to start, my dad is Chinese. He immigrated to Canada in the 1980s, and my mom is a Métis woman. And so I'm both an Indigenous woman and a second generation Chinese Canadian. And, I've been exploring my identity for my whole life. It's been an interesting journey to navigate both identities. Maybe if you would like to pull up that first slide, I'll just speak a little bit about my family. So like I mentioned, so this is my dad, and this is me when I was probably 6 years old with my pawpaw. And so this is in Hong Kong. My dad moved back to Hong Kong when I was really young. And so growing up, I was raised by my mom. But, in the summers, I think every other summer or so, I would go to Hong Kong and spend time with family there. And my Chinese name is Zhong Meiling, and my dad's family, or my side of the family, my paternal side of the family, are Hakka. So they speak Hakka, and so my grandma is my pawpaw. And on the next slide, there's a photo of me and my grandfather, and so that's my Gong Gong and I. Most of my side of the family on my dad's side lives in Amsterdam, and so this was at my grandparents' 60th wedding anniversary a couple of years ago. My grandfather since passed away, but I feel very fortunate to have such strong family ties, even though they're not here in Canada with me. On the next slide, this is a photo of when I was younger with my mom and my half sister. So my half sister, her name's Stacy. She's not Asian whatsoever. We have the same mom, but different dad. And so, yeah, I was raised by my mom. That's me, my mom, my sister, and my sister's grandma. And on the next slide, so this is just some more recent photos of my mom and I, and my partner and myself, as well as my sister, her husband, and my niece, and my mom and her late husband. He's passed away as well. Growing up, my mom and I, we moved a lot. Things were really unstable in our lives. And so we weren't connected to community or to family. And so even though, I knew from a young age that I was Métis, we weren't connected to land or community or family in a way that let me really, grow my identity from that place of kinship. But, from a very young age, what I began to realize is, how racism impacted me differently based on both of my identities. And one story I like to share, and this is probably one of my most impactful memories and identity forming memories from my childhood. My mom and I had moved to rural Manitoba, about 3 hours north of Winnipeg. And I was maybe 7 or 8 years old, and I was playing in the backyard with a friend of mine. And we were having a great time. And I remember she had, a tree house, and we were just being kids. And suddenly she said to me, "I have to go inside, but I'm sorry, you can't come with me." And being 8, I just asked, why? And she replied with, "My parents don't let Native kids in the house." And so in that moment, being 8, it became clear to me that perhaps if I identified as Chinese, that, it would be more beneficial for me in this scenario. And so I said to her, I'm not Native, I'm Chinese. And she said, okay, well, let me go ask my parents. So she goes in the house and she comes back outside and she says, my parents said you can come in the house. And so we went on to have a friendship of over, a couple of years. I spent lots of time with her family, but it was really identity forming because it became very clear to me from that age that yes, I did experience anti-Asian racism, and uh, it was less, it posed less barriers to me than, identifying as Métis, as being Indigenous. And not only that, within my family on my dad's side, I also remember from a young age approaching him and saying, "Papa, guess what? I'm Métis," and he would say, "No, you're not. You're Chinese. You're Chung, and I don't want to hear you say that." And so from those moments, and despite again not having any Chinese family in Canada and being raised by an Indigenous mom, I only identified as Chinese. And when people would ask me deeper questions around that about, do you have any Aboriginal in you? Like you look a little bit maybe. And I just straight out say, no, I'm half Scottish. Or I would say, like maybe a little bit, like barely anything. And so I grew a lot of shame over the years and I wore a mask for many, many years. And I didn't have strong roots in my Indigenous identity, but I didn't really have strong roots in my Chinese identity either. But what that did was when I went to university, I started to really question, my dad came to Canada as a young adult. Where along the way did he learn, more mainstream, prejudiced, racist ideas about Indigenous people? And just how do immigrants learn about Indigenous people? Where are those opportunities? And being in Winnipeg, Winnipeg has a very high visible Indigenous population and a very diverse population too. So I was just seeing in my own physical kind of environment that there weren't relationships being built and that there weren't opportunities for relationship building. So when I was 24, I started the Immigration and Settlement Studies program at Ryerson University, and it was a fresh start for me. And that was the first time I was able to openly identify as both an Indigenous woman and a Chinese woman. And so I undertook research around, how, where are relationships being built between Indigenous peoples and racialized immigrants? What are the opportunities and how do we build solidarity? And so 3 things that I found in my research that was really interesting to me was that one, and again, this research happened in 2011, so it was pre-Truth and Reconciliation Commission report, and it was a different kind of time than we're in now. And so there was no land acknowledgements, and I think it was just a different time. But I think certain things haven't changed much. So there aren't really opportunities for people new to Canada to really learn about the history of colonization and about Indigenous peoples here. Number 2, there's racism embedded in the immigration system. And so, for example, when a refugee is connecting with an immigration officer and the immigration officer sees that refugee is coming to Winnipeg, there are documented examples of the immigration officer saying to that person, "Oh, you're going to Winnipeg, watch out for the natives," or something really, really racist and derogatory. And so not only aren't there opportunities to learn, but what they're being told does not provide that opportunity for actual learning and dismantling of racism. And the third thing I saw in my research is that one of the most powerful ways to build relationship and examples that I saw from across Canada, one in particular being in Vancouver, where they had dialogue circles for Indigenous folks and for Chinese people in the city of Vancouver, was that opportunities for dialogue sharing and storytelling were so impactful in dismantling some of those prejudices. And for me, part of my own healing, and I think it's part of healing for a lot of Indigenous peoples as well, is this opportunity to share one story. And so there's this beautiful quote that I came across, and I'll just share it with you. So, the will to change has to come from an ability to imagine oneself in a different skin, a different story, a different place, and then desire this new self in place that one sees. The sensibility, the sensibility of this transformation includes the ability to tell, to listen to, and above all, make for stories to be heard. And so I think that's, for me, one of the most impactful things that I've had is our opportunities to do this, to learn from one another. And, that's at a personal level, on a broader systemic level. And I think maybe May will be speaking a bit to this, but, really understanding that the systems in Canada were built to uphold, a certain framework, which is white supremacy, and that when we see how these different systems impact us, and when we see that we're stronger when we're fighting not only anti-racism against people like us, but also anti-Indigenous racism, anti-Black racism, that it makes all of our efforts stronger. And so to me, yeah, one of the most impactful ways has been opportunities to simply share stories. There's much more work that needs to be done, much more systems work, organizational work, policy and legislation work that needs to happen. But that's been part of my story and my journey in understanding both of those identities. So thank you.
Thank you, Melissa. Thank you so much for your sharing. Yeah, and maybe we can hear from May as well, and then we can continue our discussion.
Yeah, great. Thank you. Thanks, ProTech, Alan, Rain, and Keith. And thank you, Melissa. That's a lot of mirrors and reflections in my story. My dad, so I'm mixed race. My dad was Chinese, came to Canada in the 50s to study engineering at McGill University in Montreal. And my mom, from a Jewish family. My mom's mother was also born in Montreal, but her parents immigrated from Romania in the sort of 1910s. So I'm sort of first generation on one side, and I guess third generation on the other, and also very light-skinned, and sort of acknowledging that I'm not always seen or read as being Chinese. I don't speak the language, and one of the pieces for my parents in raising my sister and I, and maybe we can pull up my my slide with my photos. Is just basically having us be Canadian, which meant white. And so even though we ate Chinese food at home, my dad actually taught my mom to cook Chinese food because he did not like white people's food. And we and so I sort of learned chopsticks, and we sort of did sort of all the sort of Chinese food things, but we never celebrated Chinese New Year or Lunar New Year. We didn't celebrate any of the Jewish holidays either. So there was this sort of assimilation agenda that our parents wanted for us, regardless, of course, of how the world was going to treat us. Because and for my sister and I, it's funny because sometimes we pass as white, sometimes we don't. Being from Quebec, especially with a last name like Louis, is because Louis is a word in French, so there's sort of ambiguity around that, and I sort of took that passing as a bit of a privilege. Once in a while, I would experience racism, and still do once in a while, and it's I think part of what that meant for me around that privilege of passing was about what led me to the work that I've done for the past over 20 years, which is as an anti-racism and anti-oppression educator, mostly with nonprofit organizations. And I think even though I myself haven't experienced a great deal of injustice, racist injustice personally, as someone that sort of wants a world that is much less racist, that's something that I want to sort of work towards. And I'm very aware in terms of, you know, sort of both on both sides of my family. It's interesting because my maternal grandmother would often say anti-Chinese things about my dad and how he spoke with an accent. Um, and my dad my dad was very conservative, and so he would often say a number of different problematic things, sexist and other homophobic, and just, I think, absorbing the general anti-Black racism from the world, from the outside world. As a child, it's hard to not do that if you grow up in Canada, and never, or very rarely being targeted for racism because of being so light and passing as white. So that sort of brought me to sort of a place of both analyzing and also educating both myself and others about injustice, and what we will, I hope, get to near the end of tonight, which is talking about sort of ways forward and positive, actions that we can do individually and collectively in community. So thank you. That's my piece at this point.
Thank you. So before we get into more discussion, maybe we want to post a poll about the focus of our discussion tonight, which is anti-Indigenous and anti-Black racism. So we would first like you to respond whether you have witnessed anti-Indigenous racism since COVID, especially, and whether you have witnessed anti-Black racism since COVID. And if you say yes to either of the above questions, what was your reaction or action that you've taken at that time? And you can select more than one answer, right? And you can put in other suggestions in the chat box. So while people are responding, I just wanted to first appreciate both of your sharing. And also, I think one very interesting point that both of you brought out is the issues of passing. And as we know that as racial minorities, we are visibly, different, and those are not necessarily things we can pass for, but there are other marginalized groups who have invisible traits that oftentimes we might be passing in order to preserve safety or to retain some of the privilege or access that we have. So I think sexual minorities being one example, people with various health conditions or disabilities would be others. So I think when we talk about anti-Indigenous and anti-Black racism and solidarity, I think we would be important to be mindful of other minorities and marginalized groups that we also need to build solidarity with. Right? So I think people have responding, right? I can see the thing.
So this poll is anonymous. We're not going to share any of this results elsewhere, so it is safe to do this poll.
Okay,
You can mute it.
so can the panelists see the results?
Okay.
Okay, so maybe we can share the result. So would you like to comment on that? And I guess there are a fair number of us who actually have witnessed anti-Black and anti-Indigenous racism. So would our panelists like to, maybe comment and share some of the examples that, what we have seen as examples of anti-Indigenous or anti-Black racism in the Chinese Canadian communities? I think it would be really helpful for us to first reflect on ourselves as Chinese Canadian community, how we might have participated, in this, right?
Yeah, I guess
Mhm.
I can speak a little bit to my family situation. So I had mentioned, my dad from an early age, expressing discomfort with me identifying as Indigenous. And it's over the years, we've been able to have many, many conversations. And so I'm really proud of my dad with how far he's come and in his own understanding. And I think that one thing about sharing stories too is that like there's that opportunity to acknowledge the history of both colonization in Canada, and the impacts that creates on Indigenous folks, and then also for Asian communities. While at times, and we had spoken about this within one of our conversations prior to the webinar, is that some second generation Chinese Canadians prior to COVID-19 had not personally felt that they experienced racism in their life. And so that there's these periods of privilege where, as minorities of Asian descent, that the model minority myth plays which is damaging, but plays a part in being able to kind of skirt outward racism and also fit in systems that allow us to be there in jobs and education and to get proper health care, but that in the history of Canada, it's not always been that way for Chinese Canadians, right? And so when we understand that in times when things aren't bad, they're good, but when they're bad, they're really, really, really damaging to the community. And so I think in COVID-19, we're seeing that resurgence again. And so when we can acknowledge the history and that the systems, while they benefit certain groups at certain times, they're never fully, working for any racialized class, unfortunately. And so when there's that acknowledgement, I think that there's certain times we benefit and certain times we don't, that I think there's a greater acknowledgement that we need to do something to dismantle these systems that continue to oppress various communities.
Yeah, and in terms of just picking up on what you're saying, Melissa, is is that sort of people sometimes use the term white adjacent for Chinese or East Asian folks, that that there's the model minority myth, which is it's real, but it's also grounded in racism, and it's completely conditional on whatever. And I think we've seen in COVID sort of much more overt sort of anti-East Asian racism, and directed at Chinese people, but also people who are thought to be Chinese. And then there's the sort of double sort of place of Chinese Canadian community experiences this racism. And at times, people in the Chinese Canadian community can also perpetuate anti-Black racism and anti-Indigenous racism. And this is complex. There's no sort of easy way to explain it. And then both are true. So it's not that one erases the other. But something that's important in terms of what you've said already, Melissa, is that, under white supremacy, under what that means, and being, we can use the term white adjacent, but just understanding that it's conditional, it can be taken away at any point, and we have much better chances of actually dismantling the system by uniting together, as, BIPOC, Black, Indigenous people of color, and standing up for each other, for other fights that aren't ours, so that we stand up for other communities stand up for us. And that has happened. In Toronto, it's definitely happened for a number of decades. Sometimes it's more, sort of it comes and goes depending on what's going on. And when in terms of Alan's comment about other kinds of oppressions, absolutely that kind of intersectional, oppression and understanding, and standing up again for other issues like queer issues, like, issues of poverty and homelessness. So I think that's important. It's not that complicated to have sort of a complex, analysis around how all these oppressions are all negative and whether they specifically impact either you personally or your community in general. We sort of all need to sort of be fighting and struggling together.
Thanks for that, May.
Thank you.
I think,
Mhm.
oh,
Yeah.
sorry, Alan, I was just gonna say, and also that, and I think that's what you're saying too, May, is that in fact, it works to pit us against each other. That's part of what makes this all work, right? Is that it pits groups against one another. And so, yeah.
So I think it might be helpful to maybe, look at some examples of like how sometimes our community participate in some of these other forms of discrimination, right? Both internally and toward other racialized community. I guess one of the examples that in our planning that people have submitted to us is about the Chinese restaurant that has treated their Black customer differently by demanding them they pay in advance compared to other people. Are you aware of that example? You want to comment on that? I think May, you're quite aware of that incident.
Yeah, no, I prepared just some sort of brief little sort of facts for folks around, if people don't remember the yeah, maybe we'll get to the systemic racism piece in a moment. So it was a young man named Emil Wickham, who had gone to Hong Xing Restaurant, which is downtown Toronto on Dundas Street, and to celebrate a birthday in May 2014. And what happened was he was with 3 other young Black men, so 4 young Black men who went to have some food, and the server told them that they'd have to prepay for their meal because that was the restaurant policy. They prepaid, and then they were the only Black customers. Emil Wickham then asked other customers around the restaurant if they also had to prepay, and none of them had to prepay. So they decided to get a refund and leave the restaurant, and they left the restaurant without having any meals. And then he decided to pursue a complaint with the Ontario Human Rights Commission because that is, of course, illegal to do. This is a practice that is often used with Black folks, especially in the States. It doesn't make it any less illegal. And 4 years later, in 2018, the restaurant was ordered to pay a cash settlement of $10,000, and obviously was told not to have that practice any longer of asking Black patrons to prepay. And this was an example that was, I think, hard and challenging for the Chinese Canadian community to see, and to sort of, reckon with really around this was not okay. At the same time, we can assume that the restaurant owner and family were had experienced themselves, anti-Chinese racism, but it was a very clear sort of case of this was, not something that was right, and it was, it was nice that Mr. Wickham won the case. Not a lot of human rights complaints go all the way and are and are successful that way, but it did leave the community, the Chinese Canadian community, needing to reckon with these tensions and challenges. Melissa, did you want to comment?
Yeah, I guess, and again, it's hard for me to specifically speak on behalf of like the Chinese community and here in Canada, because all of my community is not in Canada. My family, lives overseas, so it's hard for me to talk about that from the Chinese community here. But I guess I would just say that, within my own family and in Winnipeg in general, I think that so many of our systems are just really, and I get this would be across Canada, but we have such deep issues of systemic racism against Indigenous folks, and a lot of people are taking lead on fighting those systems and standing up and within the Indigenous community, and but I think for Chinese folks and is to understand what these struggles are about, right, and to understand that history. And I think it's easy just to see that as a struggle separate from the Chinese community, but in fact, being here in Canada, being here on Indigenous land, it is really incumbent upon all communities, long-standing ones here in Canada and new folks to Canada to understand that history and that these struggles impact all Canadians, and yeah, and it really starts with learning, I think, really truly understanding that history and being able to see why these efforts are taking place.
So yeah, thank you. I think we all realize and recognize the importance of building solidarity with other marginalized groups and with Indigenous people and Black people. I think the interesting thing with COVID at the beginning of the epidemic, obviously, as Melissa talked about, the Asian and especially the Chinese Canadian community was the first targeted and blamed for the pandemic. And then as the pandemic evolved, I think it really revealed the deep-seated systemic racism that was in place. And then we end up seeing the people who face layers of other intersectional discrimination really disproportionately impacted. So we can see now like the Black community, Indigenous community, and other communities become more and more affected directly, as well as discriminated throughout that process, right? So I think that's probably like a very compelling example of how we need to stand together. But I think there's also like the tension about like, did we really stand with each other when the struggle started, or did we feel the same empathy and connection, and did we actually honor each other's history of struggle throughout that process, right? Or is it because we are all in this situation together, then we simply need to do that? So I think that's something that may be worth exploring, and how that system kind of divide us by those different levels and layers of discrimination. And I think in the chat we see that Anna has put in, I think one of her experiences is echoing what Melissa was talking about. This one women play that she saw in BC, right? Yeah, about the person playing a play that she actually become her father, her mother, herself as a child, as a student, and navigating through decades of hiding her indigenous identity behind the Chinese heritage. So maybe Melissa or May, you can comment more on the interrelatedness and the tension that impact our effectiveness and solidarity building.
Well, the one thing I wanted to say, Alan, about your example of COVID, right? Because I think that there still is an anti-Chinese, thing going on, that it still is very alive as the China virus and all that stuff. I just saw something about a bar in London, Ontario that had a sort of in front of its bar saying, we like Chinese people, but we don't like the China virus, just a bunch of racist stuff. And he's refusing to take it down. I have an image of it, but I can't access it right now. But so yeah, and that was just, like whatever this week. So so that still is very live. But the difference around who is impacted by COVID, both sort of percentage wise in terms of populations, is absolutely linked to class and jobs, right? So we have frontline essential workers, also known as grocery store workers making minimum wage, who are face to face with people hours and hours every day. And these folks are mostly, sort of Black and other immigrant, mostly women actually, and making very, very bad money sort of on the front lines. And absolutely medical folks are also, at high risk just because they're medical folks, including personal support workers and long-term care home workers and folks that are not necessarily working in hospitals. People working in hospitals generally tend to be better paid, whereas personal support workers dominated by immigrant women of color who make barely minimum wage. So, so putting in sort of the lens of class, and people talked about the map of Toronto that has where the highest COVID cases are, and that is completely mappable onto lower income communities. And so there's and who mostly lives in lower income communities are immigrant and people of color. There are white folks there, absolutely, but in terms of the sort of dominant numbers. So I think that, if we're talking about making the connections between racism that we face as a Chinese Canadian community and racism that other communities face, that statistically, especially around COVID, in general, the Chinese community does not face. It is absolutely possible to bridge those gaps, and there are, it's possible and necessary, and it happens. Like I said, I think it happens based on different groups, in different, it has to, I guess, different cities. It's organized locally, and you just have to either find that, or I'm thinking of Asians for Black Lives, which was organizing around 2014, 2015 around the Black Lives Matter Toronto solidarity. And just they did a whole letter campaign, and they had a letter translated into a number of different languages, from not just Chinese, because there's different kinds of Chinese, as we know, but also different countries in Asia, so that folks could bring that to their parents, family who may not speak English, to bring that level of awareness out there.
Mm-hmm.
Do you want to show you a slide on the systemic?
Sure. I've talked a lot already. I don't know, Melissa, if you want to start on the systemic racism tree.
You go ahead.
Okay, so this is I provided this image. This is part of the work that I do in terms of understanding the, in a very basic way, sort of 3 layers in which racism functions. And so sort of the leaves, the branches would be where we see racism happening, where it's sort of more obvious. And especially now in the last, 5-10 years, where there's everyone carries a video camera with them. Even though, of course, we know very well that this has been going on for much longer than that, but there now can be proof for people that need proof of this kind of stuff happening. So this is the sort of overt person to person. You can sort of read, I won't read the different bullet points there, but sort of happens on sort of an individual level. And the trunk of the tree sort of represented by sort of institutional ideologies and structures. So whether that's policies and laws, sort of media cultural practices, we can look at the education system, sort of many other systems, criminal justice system, legal system that institute different forms of racism. And so examples can be very clearly, let's say, for example, immigration law in terms of what countries are more desired and what countries are less desired for immigrants to come into. And that has changed, as we can imagine, let's say even taking the last 100 years. And there was certainly a time when Chinese were excluded, the Chinese Exclusion Act, as well as the bringing in the railroad workers at the turn of the previous century, and paying them, much less than the white workers, as one example. And that's legal, right? So that's what happens when something is sort of institutionalized. And then if we look at the roots that connect it all. So in other words, if we go back up to the leaves, Chinese Canadian community may not, let's say, get carded by the police the way Black communities in cities like Toronto and Indigenous people in cities like Winnipeg, Saskatoon, Regina, where they are, huge proportions of the population, or not huge, but much bigger than they are in a city like Toronto. So it can be practices that don't actually affect the Chinese community as much statistically, but the roots, as we can see, the institutions and the roots are the same. So colonialism, white supremacy, capitalism, patriarchy. So the benefits that we were talking about earlier, Melissa was mentioning the model minority, that's up at the top. That's like an everyday manifestation of a form, not of racism, but a form of, let's say, privilege or white adjacency, but the roots are the same, which is why it can be taken away so quickly, right? It's why when COVID comes, and I'm thinking about SARS, remember SARS from 10 plus years ago? And it was instantly like Chinatown was just a ghost town. And Chinatown actually felt the effects of COVID-19 much earlier, way before the lockdown. I remember January when it first, sort of was identified in Wuhan, China, that Chinatown, certainly in Toronto, and I think across a lot of the diaspora, it was just, people stopped going just because this is an old, the anti-Chinese stuff is old. It sort of can surface at different times and it can be submerged, but it's always there. And I think it's important to not feel too complacent or even like, happy or relieved or whatever feelings we may feel if we are not specifically being targeted in a specific moment in history or time, simply because that's not sustainable. And it's the alliances that I think we're going to talk about next that are more about ongoing connections to each other's struggles. Because, and, in terms of Alan sort of framing it like, is this because we're being opportunistic? Like, help, we're under the gun now, as opposed to, yeah, we're under the gun now and other folks will be under the gun another time. Some people are always under the gun, right? Especially Black and Indigenous populations, right? Sort of Islamophobia, for example, sort of comes and goes as well, but it's always kind of also just there. So that's also important to understand. And Islam is not a race, but Islam is also identified with specific countries, even though Islam is everywhere. So just as an example of other places that we can
Mhm.
you know, that we can forge alliances and show up, right? Show up for other folks when they have vigils, when they have rallies, when they have memorials, when they have different things, and we show up for them, they show up for us, you know, and it becomes this, this, I mean, we can't show up in person in the same way these days, but yeah, that's sort of my, you know, sort of ending on a more sort of hopeful note, because there are ways out. There are multiple
Mhm.
ways out, and it's constant. I don't know that we'll ever get there, but we need to try, and we need to be there.
So I would invite, thanks, May. I would invite our participants to put in the, your comments if you want to share and raise some comments in person. You're welcome to raise hand, and we'll, unmute your sound as well. I saw that Richard put in the comment that I think a lot of Chinese community, there is a lack of awareness on the struggles of indigenous people, and he's heard very hurtful, stereotypic comments on indigenous people. So maybe as part of our last discussion, kind of focused, in terms of how we can truly build effective and respectful allyship. Like how do we deal with such incidents, or when sometimes we hear that from our friends, or when we hear at work, and like anything ranging from microaggression to these hurtful statements and wrong stereotypes. How do we react on a personal, interpersonal, or a system level? So maybe
Yeah.
Melissa, you want to start? Yeah.
Sure. And just speaking to that point, I think that's where, and since 2015 in the release of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission report, that what's so important across Canada and across communities and individuals is that we can't have reconciliation without the truth part. So understanding the history and current realities. So it's not just a thing in the past, it's ongoing, again, systemic oppression of Indigenous peoples in Canada, that we need to understand how the history has impacted, how colonization, residential school system, 60s scoop, and a continued rejection of Indigenous rights in Canada has had these effects that are still with us. And so I think, learning the history, learning the current reality, and understanding that is what helps us to understand why they're, to dismantle untruths, but then to also understand why, communities and folks are continuing to struggle in certain ways. And, in a country as rich as Canada, it's like totally unreasonable and abhorrent to have over 50 communities without clean drinking water. And so it's like simple things like this across Canada that you can't know about if you're not actively seeking out opportunities to learn. And then I also think, finding ways to show up, and like May was saying, to show up for other communities, whether it's Indigenous or Black or other communities, really kind of, it just humanizes one another. And I think that you're less likely just to adopt these mainstream racist ideas when you are actively learning and seeking out opportunities to engage. And so yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So of course, like one important thing is really to learn about the history of the intergenerational systemic violence that the Indigenous people suffered in the country. But as like a lot of, for example, newcomers, and I think you spoke to the earlier about the lack of built-in system of education on good information that is being provided through our educational system, through our public resources to support that. How can we proactively seek to understand the truth more? Like I think like we also very tired to say that like the people of color have to keep educating white people about racism, right?
Yeah.
So I think the Indigenous people are also very tired of having to educate everybody else about, the struggle. So how do we really truly respectfully make an effort? In what ways can we do that in our daily life? Do we have to wait for crisis to happen to show up in protest, or is there ways that we can integrate that into our everyday learning?
There's lots of things out there for free. The National Center for Truth and Reconciliation has an amazing array of tools and videos. It's housed at the University of Manitoba. The archives are there, and so they do a lot of work to get that information out there. It's advocating within your circles or within your organizations for cultural awareness training, is something basic like that. In my previous work, that's what we did. We went into organizations and we provided cultural awareness training around truth and reconciliation in the workplace and how that can play out. And if you are reaching out to organizations, I say just do your homework, understand, the group you're reaching out to, their history, the work that they do, and make sure that anything that when you are reaching out, that you're doing it in a spirit of reciprocity. And so that you're not just reaching out to get info and then leave and never show up again. But it's that reciprocity where you're wanting to build that relationship, and then you're ensuring that, it's mutually beneficial, because this work is hard work, right? And it's heart work, and it's, when relationships are approached from, being firmly in reciprocity, I think that's where, relationships can be very, very productive and beneficial, right?
And just sort of looking at sort of Richard's point about hearing things in the Chinese Canadian community, whether they're anti-Indigenous or anti-Black. And this is a challenge I put to anyone that wants to be an ally, is challenge it every time. And if you have educated yourself, as Melissa has indicated, if everyone who's listening now, or anyone that wants to engage on this level, if you have enough information that you can challenge it, and every time is a high bar, but letting it go by in silence is implying that it's okay, or it's certainly okay then to talk about that in front of me because I haven't challenged you. So, and you can challenge respectfully. You can say, that's actually a lot of misinformation. That's racist information, without saying the person is racist, and give them some truths. And if you have some, whether it's, again, sort of social media, whether it's, bloggers or videos and people that can be sort of quickly referred to, sort of Google sort of this person and check this out. And, we actually have more in common, as Chinese Canadians with, these struggles than the white, sort of settler population, and to make links that way. And if you're on social media, there's tons of different groups you can follow. There's petitions to sign. There's lots and lots of different ways. But I think that ripple effect outward is also much more powerful when it happens sort of interpersonally and within our families, and then it sort of ripples out from there. So there are sort of, small, medium, and large, sort of actions that you can do starting today. Like, you don't need anything much more than what you already know, that this is not not great, and sort of have how to move things along, because when we are misinformed and no one tells us, then we just stay misinformed.
Thank you. Would either of you like to comment on the question that Subeda posed? So about gender, so I think in both of the cases of Melissa and May, your dads were the Chinese person. So how would you imagine your experience might have been different if instead your moms were Chinese and your dads were Indigenous or Romanian?
So
Or
my mom
Jewish,
was my primary caregiver. Like I said, I was raised by my mom, so my life experience is very much tied with my mom and her identity as a Métis woman. And so I think that had my mom been Chinese, my own identity formation would have been different if she raised me as a Chinese woman. I think I would have had a stronger grounding in my Chinese identity, likely. But I don't know. Like it's interesting. Like I'm not sure. I haven't really thought about it, and that's a good question.
Yeah, and I would say very similar, right? Because it's generally mothers that nurture children and care for children. And so whatever that means about how that sort of culture gets passed through. I also knew and know my mother's family. Both my dad's parents died before he was 10. He was raised by family in China, and there's no family in Canada that he was close to. So sort of similar to Melissa that, and I never visited China, so I didn't get to see any of my probably remote sort of cousins because he had a whole bunch of brothers, but they were all much, much older than him. So it's kind of impossible to answer, but I would say similar to Melissa's answer that because it's women that carry, for good or bad, sort of carry that sort of culture and sort of, my mom's side of the family is Jewish, but again, with that assimilation agenda, there wasn't a lot of sort of Jewish, traditions passed on. I've actually had to reclaim in adulthood both Chinese and Jewish traditions with my multicultural group of friends, and which has been fun and different, and I'm enjoying that. But it's not exactly the same as if I had actually learned it as a child. But good question.
So thank you all very much for this really interesting, personal, and powerful sharing. And I just like to I guess it's really important for us to reflect and hold ourselves accountable, especially with the COVID really becoming I guess both a crisis and opportunity for our communities to really connect and build solidarity with broader communities and work together. So we would like to thank May and Melissa for really insightful sharing, and we wanted to invite you to fill out our exit poll on the opinion about our session. So thank you very much. So is there any closing comments you would like to share with us before we close today?
Just thank you very much for the opportunity to share my story. And prior to this opportunity, I wasn't aware of the work of ProTech so yeah, I'm happy to be more aware of this work and be more connected in that way. And I will be following the work of ProTech moving forward. So thanks for the opportunity.
Thank you. May?
Yeah, thank you for inviting me to speak. It was great to meet Melissa. I've known Rain and Alan and Keith for a number of years here and there within the very small progressive Chinese Canadian community in Toronto. So happy to be a part of this, and and hope that there is something helpful that people found, and it was good to share and to learn. So thank you all.
So thank you very much again. And yeah, as a couple of weeks ago, we have invited the CCNC for Social Justice to share, and I think we learned about the importance of sharing our history and solidarity and allyship building as well. And I think today's session really broadens our connectedness to the issue and awareness. And I especially appreciate Melissa joining us from Manitoba. And let's hope that our network continues to build across the country and, working together. So thank you very much. And
Thank you.
good night.
Good night.
Thank you.
Good night.
Bye now.